This video is to give you some tips and tricks on how to use your watercolor palette to create different values and different effects when you are painting in your artwork. Now, when you're finished working every time, you're going to want to wipe out your tray where you're blending your colors. And when you're done, you want to leave this tray open so that the paints will dry out. Right now, they're dry. Nothing comes off on your finger. If you leave them closed and it doesn't dry and you pick it up and move it, sometimes the paint will spill out. So to activate this paint, we are going to dip our brush in our clean water, and we're going to swirl it around in our paint. And we don't need to push down hard. We only need to paint with the tip of the brush. So I only need to swirl the tip of my brush into my paint. And the first technique is what we normally do, which is wet paint on dry paper. So when you are painting, you want to angle the tip of your brush toward the edge of the shape that you are painting, and change that angle whenever your shape changes. You might want to turn your paper to help you angle that point of that brush toward the edge, and that is going to help you stay inside the line. Notice that I have enough water on my brush to keep painting, but it's not so much that it's pooling out and going other places where I don't want it. So you have to find a balance between how much paint and how much water you need on your brush to get the desired color. Now I'm going to clean my brush for the next technique, so in between I'm just going to clean it every time, make sure I have a clean brush, and I'm swiping it gently on the edge of my cup to get the extra water off so I don't make a mess by tapping it and flinging water everywhere. The next technique is wet on wet. So that means that I'm going to put wet paint on wet paper. So I have to put water inside of my shape first. And again, I have to make sure that the water does not go outside the edge of the shape, because if it does, then my paint will also go outside the edge of my shape. So I'm going to carefully try and keep that water inside my shape that I'm trying to paint. And once it's wet, I can take my paint from over here and I can simply drop it in to the space, and I can create a bleed sort of texture here, or I can use more of a watered down version of the color and drop that in as well, and that will go even farther. And that's going to create a texture. If you want a space to have a certain kind of blended texture, you can do that. And notice that you're going to want things to dry before you try and paint another color next to this. If I try and put a solid red next to it, it's going to bleed together. If you don't want that to happen, you have to let it dry first. So you can always work around the paper, maybe this area of the paper, let that dry first, work over here for a little while, and then once this is dry you can go back and add more detail. Now we're going to create some different values with our paint. So on this side, the darkest value can be just pure color. So I can just pull it straight from the palette. I can swirl the tip of my brush in there with not a lot of water, and I can just simply put a lot of color down inside. I'm using just very light pressure on the tip of my brush, just painting with the tip of the brush to get those small areas in the details or the edges where I need it to stay controlled, where I don't want it just going outside the lines. Now for the next one, I want the next value to be a little bit lighter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of paint over here in this puddle of water, and I'm going to check it and see it's definitely lighter than the last one. So I'm going to paint that in. Now I can add some extra water to my puddle. So the more water you have, the lighter your value is going to be. The more paint you have, the darker your value is going to be. If you end up with too much paint where it's puddling like that, you can dry off your brush, pinch that water off there with a dry brush, and you can use your brush to soak that up if you're getting too much paint puddling in a place where you don't want it to puddle. Now I can add even more water to my puddle. I'm just taking and dripping it in from my cup, and I can do my last and lightest value. So I have 4 different values of blue using the same palette. Now if I want to blend 2 colors together, I could start nice and dark on one end. If I want this side to be pure blue, I can start to blend this, and then once I get far enough where I want it to start blending, I can just take regular water, just plain water. If I can zoom it in for us a little bit. Just clean water and start to blend out that edge and bring it over this way so that it goes from light or from dark to light. And again, if there's too much water here where I don't want it, my dry brush I can just use to soak up some of that color that I don't want there. And before it dries, I can take some more clean water and really blend that out so that I've got a smooth transition from dark to light. Now I can take a second color It might work best if you let it dry first, but we're going to go ahead in and try dark purple on this end. And again, I'm going to clean off that paint off of my brush with a nice clean, simply wet brush. And I'm going to pull out that color and blend it together in the center so that in the middle we've got a mixture of purple and blue. Sometimes we don't want to just use our paint to fill in large areas. We want to create some designs. So you can just use the tip of your brush to draw lines to create detail. If you're doing that on top of color, remember to make sure that it is dry before you try and paint a clean line on top, otherwise it will bleed like our red did. And if you want something to just simply have a softer edge, we can just take that and blend it out just like we did, just with clean water. And kind of blend that out just a little bit, and you can create a different sort of edge to your line. Also, if you want to blend 2 colors together, I have a puddle of water here where I've mixed some blue and some red to make a red-violet. And so in this puddle of water, this is called a wash. So when you have a really watered down paint color, it becomes a wash, and that's good for filling in large spaces of your picture if you're coloring in a background or a very large shape. Remember though that if you want something to go right up next to another color, that first color needs to be dry first before you do it, or otherwise it will bleed together. You can also mix colors together on your paper with that wet on wet technique. So if I want to blend 2 colors together in this space, I can put down my water, and there's a little bit of color in it because my water is not clean anymore. But I've got some water there, and I've got some red, and I can drop some red down with my wet on wet technique, wet paint on wet paper. And maybe I can clean my brush all the way, take some blue or whatever color you want to blend together, and we can mix these, let them blend together, create a texture. You can leave that texture to dry like that and have that wet bleed effect. Or you can take your brush and blend it together on your paper a little bit so that the texture is still there, but maybe not quite as strong. Or simply blend it all together completely. So when you are using your analogous color scheme, or whatever color scheme you have, so if I'm using an analogous color scheme with blue, red, and purple, I can blend those three colors together in any combination I want in my artwork to create these different effects and these different values. If you have some paint at home, please try out these techniques on a separate piece of paper before doing them on your artwork, and have fun testing out your skills.